Hey, it's time for another edition of the Cseekly Recap. I'm your host Csomm, and this is a selection of news I have covered this week. The footage behind is from the game Assassin's Creed Black Flag Resynced. Let's get started with the first news, which is all about Obsidian, Avowed, and Fallout. Because apparently, according to this article, Obsidian Entertainment cancels Avowed sequel and starts to work on Fallout title amid layoffs. And if this report is accurate, I think there are three separate stories here, and it's important not to lump them together. The first one is canceling an Avowed sequel, and that's probably because it didn't become the breakout hit Microsoft probably wanted. I mean, let's be real here. If you play that game, that can never be a hit, not in a million years. And to be honest, this news is amazing because Avowed was very fucking bad. I mean, yes, it reviewed reasonably well, at least when we are talking about mainstream critics, but for people like you and me, especially when you think about it's coming from Obsidian, it was a very lackluster experience. And I'm being generous here. So I guess for Microsoft, it didn't create a kind of cultural impact that makes executives immediately greenlight a long franchise. So even if development was going well, that's not the only thing executives look at. They are probably asking questions like, will it sell enough? Spoiler alert, it won't. Is this the best use of 200 to 300 developers? Absolutely fucking not. And does it strengthen Xbox's portfolio? And I'll give you the answer right away, no. It doesn't. So as you might have guessed, it's not going to do any of these things good, especially if you compare it to Fallout. And then from a business standpoint, the decision makes sense. I mean, this would have been even more obvious if one of these Xbox people actually plays whatever the hell they put on the Xbox store, and they would axe this thing immediately. But for some strange reason, Avowed 2 was still a thing. Well, not anymore. Or at least not to a degree that was reported previously. Because what's interesting is that the article says some developers remain assigned to Avowed-related work while waiting for Fallout to ramp up. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I was the Xbox executive, I would scrap Avowed-related work, or whatever the hell that means, immediately, and shift everyone to new Fallout project. But sadly, or for better or for worse, I'm not one, so it seems that Microsoft isn't necessarily killing the IP forever, and maybe they're just simply putting it on a shelf. And who knows, maybe they'll take the shelf away and just burn it to the ground, because that would be the best possible solution ever. Now, Fallout is the obvious franchise to prioritize because Fallout is simply worth more. And not to mention, Fallout franchise, at least in Microsoft's hands, was basically collecting dust somewhere in the Microsoft basement on some forgotten shelf. And we need to take one thing into account, which is after the TV series, Fallout has arguably become Bethesda's hottest IP. You have Fallout 4 experiencing a huge resurgence. And obviously it is because there isn't anything else Fallout related to play, at least when we are talking about single player games. Then you have Fallout 76 that has been apparently healthier than many expected. And that's a game I will never play, because not only it launched in a horrible state, and that's always gonna make a mark in my psyche, but more importantly, that game is a festering pile of microtransaction hell, and my hands are never going to touch that. But yeah, the TV show introduced millions of new fans to the Fallout franchise. And Microsoft needs major exclusive franchises. So if Xbox is trying to recover from layoffs, studio closures, and disappointing hardware sales, betting on Fallout is one of the safest moves they can make. And let's be honest, from a purely financial perspective, I would invest in Fallout before Avowed every single time. However, this new Fallout thing, it's not that simple, because I am not convinced Obsidian is the right Obsidian anymore. You see, whenever people hear Obsidian making Fallout, they immediately think of Fallout New Vegas. And I talked about this topic in one of my previous videos, you can go check it out if you wanna. But the point here is that the studio that made New Vegas in 2010 is not the same studio anymore. Many of the people who define New Vegas has left over the years, and the leadership, designers, writers, and overall development culture has changed significantly. And that's why I think people should manage their expectations. Because if you expect New Vegas 2, I think you might be setting yourself up for disappointment. And trust me, I wouldn't say this, But when I take into consideration what kind of games Obsidian produced so far, I think this advice is extremely well placed. But wait, there is more, because John Sawyer might change the equation, and he might be the biggest reason for optimism. You see, John Sawyer directed New Vegas and has consistently shown he understands what makes Fallout compelling. He's also been behind projects like Pentiment, which demonstrated that he still excels at player choice, writing, and RPG systems, even on a smaller budget. So if he's genuinely leading the Fallout project, that's about as reassuring as this report gets. Problem is, he has one big challenge, and that is that one director cannot recreate the entire New Vegas team. Which brings me to the final point of this report, and that is that the layouts are worrying me more than the game announcement. Because when you lay off roughly a quarter of studio, while simultaneously starting a massive RPG, well, there's no other way to say it, it's concerning. Because large RPGs benefit from continuity, and losing experienced developers can mean several things. For example, the institutional knowledge disappears. Then you have onboarding for new people, that can take time, which then means that production will slow, and when that happens and you're not hitting your goals, morale often takes a hit. Now, it is possible the layoffs were targeted at cancelled projects rather than the Fallout team, but it still introduces risk. Overall, I would say, I think this is a rational business decision, and I'm purely speaking about Avowed being axed, because if Microsoft asked me whether to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on another Avowed or a new Fallout, I would pick Fallout every single time. However, I also think many fans are romanticizing what this means, and I will say again and again and again, this isn't the 2010 Obsidian returning to make New Vegas. It's a different studio, under different management, working with Xbox's current corporate structure. Obviously, that doesn't mean the game cannot be great, because there is potential there, especially with John Sawyer's involvement. However, I wouldn't assume this automatically guarantees another good game. And you know what's also funny? Ironically, this news also reinforces a point I already raised before in one of my previous videos. Obsidian as a name isn't enough anymore. The quality of recent releases like Avowed and The Outer Worlds 2 has led me to question whether the studio still consistently can deliver genre-defining RPGs. And if this Fallout project succeeds, it will likely be because of the team and creative direction behind it, not simply because the logo says Obsidian. Now let's focus on the next story, and this one is all about Elder Scrolls 6. Recently there has been a talk about Xbox restructuring, and this particular news is definitely going to be interesting for Elder Scrolls 6 fans, because Elder Scrolls 6 is apparently at least 2 years away. And I think the report is believable, but the bigger story isn't that the Elder Scrolls 6 is still years away. It's what that says about the current state of AAA game development, and essentially Microsoft's strategy. But this is how I see it. A 2028 release wouldn't surprise me, and if our boy Jason Schreier says it's at least 2 or more years away, I would take that seriously. The man has built one of the strongest track records in the gaming industry for accurately reporting development timelines. Love him or hate him, he has been really reliable in the past. So a late 2028 release would mean roughly a decade of active development after the game's announcement in 2018. But it's worth remembering that Bethesda wasn't actually making The Elder Scrolls 6 immediately after that reveal. The studio still had to finish Starfield, and only shifted its full attention afterwards. So while the announcement trailer is 8 years old, full production hasn't been running for all of those 8 years. And that's a really important point to make, because I would be very fucking worried if I knew that The Elder Scrolls 6 has been in active development for 10 years. And if that was the case, I would definitely expect something groundbreaking when the game finally comes out. However, one point I need to raise, and it's very important. And that's basically that the 2018 announcement is a very bad example of why publishers announce games too early. You could say that Bethesda revealed The Elder Scrolls 6 largely to reassure fans after announcing Fallout 76, and additionally, Todd Howard even said they wanted people to know it existed. And now you might ask yourself, why was that a bad idea? Well, the problem is that 8 years later, we've seen one cinematic teaser, virtually no gameplay, no release window, and almost no concrete details. And let me tell you, that creates expectations no developer can realistically satisfy over such a long period. And rightfully so. I mean, people will expect all kinds of stuff. Hell, even I expect it. And I'm fully aware that the game wasn't in development for 8 years. But some of the people will think that. And that's the biggest issue here. Also, when you think about it with all this Xbox stuff, I think Xbox needs this game more than Bethesda does. If you read through the article, you can see the following. Microsoft has closed studios, cancelled projects, laid off thousands of employees, and struggled to consistently produce blockbuster exclusives. And if the reports about doubling down on flagship franchises are accurate, then The Elder Scrolls 6 becomes more than just another RPG for Microsoft. It becomes one of the pillars of Xbox's future. And that's creating enormous pressure. Not only does the game need to review well, but also it probably needs to sell tens of millions of copies, drive Game Pass subscriptions, restore confidence in Xbox's first-party lineup, and justify Microsoft's enormous investment in Bethesda. And I don't know if Bethesda can deliver, but that's a lot to ask of one game. And speaking about Bethesda delivering, this is actually the part that worries me the most. We all know Skyrim is one of the most influential RPGs ever made, but since then, Bethesda's track record has been mixed, and that's me being generous, by the way. First, you have Fallout 4. It divided RPG fans because of its simplified dialogue and role-playing systems. Then you have Fallout 76, which launched in a disastrous state before improving significantly over time. And finally, Starfield. Yes, it reviewed well, but then again, we are talking about mainstream reviewers here. But more importantly, it generated a surprisingly polarized response. Some players loved it, while many, me included, criticized its exploration, procedural content, and outdated design philosophy. Oh yeah, and let's not forget the fiasco with paid DLCs and mods. So when you think about it, The Elder Scrolls 6 isn't launching after another Skyrim. It's pretty much launching after years of people questioning whether Bethesda's formula has evolved enough. And that brings me to another point, which is that the expectations for this game are almost impossible to meet. Well, impossible is a bit too harsh of a word. I would say it is achievable, but only if you know what you're doing. You see, when Skyrim launched in 2011, open-world RPGs looked very differently, and there was little direct competition. Not to mention, players' expectations were lower. However, today, Bethesda is competing in a world shaped by games like The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt, Elden Ring, Baldur's Gate 3, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, and many others that have redefined the open RPG genre significantly. So normally, players now expect several things. First and foremost, you have reactive worlds, then meaningful choices, then sophisticated NPC behavior, then you have modern combat, excellent storytelling, and finally, technical polish. So if you wanna be just another Bethesda RPG, well, that may no longer be enough. Thing is, if you're listening to my babbling, you might say that I'm very pessimistic about the whole situation. And I would say rightfully so, especially when I saw what Bethesda has been delivering for the past 10 years. You might argue that they know exactly how important this game is, and since they are not rushing it after what happened with Fallout 76, there might be a chance that it might actually work. Also, if Xbox is truly betting heavily on its major franchise, Microsoft has every incentive to give Bethesda the time and resources needed to get The Elder Scrolls 6 right. So a delayed Elder Scrolls is far less damaging than another disappointing launch. Ultimately, I would say that my biggest concern about this whole situation isn't the release date. It's whether Bethesda has fundamentally evolved its game design. If The Elder Scrolls 6 feels like Skyrim with prettier graphics, I don't think the reaction is going to be positive at all. However, if it modernizes exploration, RPG systems, NPC simulation, and all that stuff that I mentioned previously, while giving us the player freedom that we experienced in Skyrim, there is still a spark of hope that the game has potential to be pretty damn good. So to conclude, after waiting well over a decade since Skyrim, I don't think people are simply looking for more Elder Scrolls. They are expecting Bethesda to show that it can still set the standard for open-world RPGs rather than follow it. Can they do it? Well, only time will tell. And to wrap up this recap, let's talk about this particular news. Basically, the title says, no RPG needs to be longer than 40 hours. And when you think about it, this is actually a great topic because it cuts to a debate that's becoming more relevant as game budgets and prices keep increasing. Now, I think the article makes somewhat solid points, but it also overstates its case with a 40-hour tops rule. Here is how I would break it down. The biggest issue isn't that RPGs are long. I would say the biggest issue is that many are padded. What does that actually mean? Well, a lot of modern RPGs mistake content for value. Instead of adding meaningful quests, they add stuff like repetitive fetch quests, copy-paste dungeons, excessive crafting, unnecessary level grinding, bloated dialogue, or huge empty maps. And I bet my ass you can identify several games that are doing this bullshit. So basically what happens, you as a player, you are spending 20 hours doing activities that could have been cut without hurting the experience. One example that comes to mind is Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and rightfully so because it has been often criticized for exactly this. The main story can easily stretch past 60 hours because the game constantly forces you through regional story arcs that often feel disconnected from the central narrative. And I know because I played the game and I experienced exactly that. I was basically doing these regional story arcs because I wanted to clear the map, but also I wanted to gear up my character, and suddenly I completely forgot what's the main plot all about. And let me tell you, that's not epic. That's a textbook pacing problem. Another thing that this article is mentioning is that people want their $80 worth of time invested in the game. And I actually think this mindset isn't fully outdated. However, I would argue most people would rather play one incredible 30-hour RPG than one mediocre 100-hour RPG. Simply put, nobody finishes a fantastic 30-hour game wishing there had been another 40 hours of filler. Essentially, quality creates value, not runtime. However, psychologically speaking, if you paid $60 for something and you invested 60 hours in it, especially if the game was marketed like that, then you can kinda feel okay, in a sense that it was $1 per hour value. On the other hand, if the trailers were promising all kinds of wild stuff, and you actually believe it because rarely people will show proper gameplay, and then you play the game and all its gameplay elements and story and feature and all that stuff is very fucking bad, naturally you're gonna feel bad because you spent so much money and you received barely 30 hours of game time. Which, by the way, more often than not, it's mediocre at best. So yeah, the value argument does and does not hold, but it fully depends on the situation. And it should not be generalized, because if we had the ability to do so with games, we would have completely different landscape in front of us. The final point that the article is mentioning that I sort of agree with is that 40 hours is enough for almost any story. Now, if you look outside gaming, for example Lord of the Rings Extended Trilogy, or Game of Thrones, or Breaking Bad, these stories introduce dozens of characters, multiple plot points, politics, betrayals, emotional arcs, and satisfying conclusions. Except obviously Game of Thrones, but we don't talk about that. Anyway, 40 hours could be considered an enormous amount of time to tell a story. Which brings me to my next point, which is, if an RPG still hasn't gotten to the point after 40 hours, that's probably a writing issue. However, there is a much better rule to judge a game by, and I personally believe a much better philosophy would be this. An RPG should only be as long as its best ideas last. For example, some games can justify a 20-hour story, some games do with 35, some do with 60, some do with more than 100 hours. But the problem starts when developers continue adding content after they've already exhausted their mechanics or narrative. And you can easily tell when a game has started recycling itself. So, like I said, there is not a golden rule, and when you think about it, there isn't a blueprint what kind of length the main story should be for an RPG. And that's one of the reasons The Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt is so highly regarded, because you can roll credits after a reasonable amount of time, but if you are interested in the world, there are a dozen more hours waiting for you, and everybody wins. Overall, you could say that the issue isn't length, and I don't think it will ever be. The main issue is respect for the player's time. A game shouldn't deliberately slow progression with repetitive objectives, force grinding, oversized maps, or filler dialogue simply to advertise 100+ hours of gameplay. But same thing goes in the opposite direction. If you have a 20-hour game, but the story is dogshit, you bet your ass I'm going to be upset when I paid 60, 70, even $80 for that product, only to get basically nothing. And also, let's not forget about one main thing here. Everybody has a different value perception. And because of that, different people will have different opinions. However, you can still make a point if you give a proper example why this particular game is too long or why the other game is too short. And that descriptive element is all that matters. Because, for example, you could say The Witcher 3 is too long, but if you cannot give a proper reason why that is a problem, then there is no problem whatsoever to begin with. And that's why it's always better to read a review or listen to someone who is doing this stuff on YouTube, a reviewer that you trust, for example, whereby you can see through their content that they have actually played the game and pointed out what was good and what was bad about it, regardless of the length of the said game. And as my final thought, I would say this. The RPGs people remember most aren't usually remembered because they were long. In fact, I've never seen that ever being a case. They are remembered because every hour felt worthwhile. And that's basically it when it comes to the news that I covered this week. Thanks very much for watching, and as always, I encourage you to leave comments. I read all of them, and I'm very happy to interact there with you guys. And also, if you enjoy this content, consider liking it and subscribing for more discussions like this. And that's it from me, until the next one.